conclusion and recommendation and the findings of the European Court of Auditor Special Report 9/2018 on public-private partnerships. And apologies for not being there with you due to some weather constraints in Luxembourg. I hope that this presentation, which indeed focuses on the main messages of the report of number 9 of 2018, can shed some lights on what are the main shortcomings, but also some good practices we identified when doing these audits, which focused on how public-private partnerships could be effectively coupled with European Union funding. The results and the findings I'm going to discuss date back as of 2018, when the audit was completed, but I'm sure that some of the overarching messages and findings will still be of application today. So to give you a brief overview of how my presentation will look like, I'm going to share with you some background information to get you into the subject, and then focus on our audit scope and approach. So basically what we audited and what was our methodology, to then go in deep into the observations coming from the audit, to then conclude with our recommendation to Commission and Member States on how to improve the coupling of European Union funding with public-private partnerships. Before entering into the audit scope and to the audit observations, please allow me to very briefly, given the audience, give you a reminder of what are we talking about. Here in the slide, I'm showing an example of public-private partnership, a so-called DBMFO, so a design, build, maintain, fund, and operate PPP, where we see that compared to a traditional project, a traditional procurement, where the public partner is basically designing the project and then procuring the construction of the project to then take back the operation once the construction is completed. Under a DBMFO PPP, the government, the public sector is launching procurement for both construction and operation of infrastructure. Let's see in this case a road. The selected private partner, as a result of the procurement, is then in charge of designing the solution, look and secure funding on the market or from financial institution. Then he's in charge of constructing the infrastructure itself, and then to operate and maintain it over the period the PPP is running. During this period of operation, the public sector, the government, which can be a national government or a local government, then pays a fee to the private partner, a fee which is defined at the beginning of the contract, and it can be, in this example, an availability payment, so linked to the actual availability, the opening of the infrastructure for use by the final users, or under different type of contracts, it can be a linked to the demand or the traffic, the use of the infrastructure by the final users. At the end of the project, at the end of the PPP period, the infrastructure is transferred back to the public sector, which at that moment can decide what to do with it, either operate it directly or launch another concession or so on. So having understood what is the subject, what was the subject of our audit, I want to give you a few indication of why it was important for us, for the European Court of Auditors, to run a performance audit on EU co-funding and public-private partnership. If we look back at the figures as of the period 1990 to 2016, what we observed back then was a very important trend towards more intensive leveraging of public and private money. There were calls from the Commission, from EU strategic documents, to leverage as much as possible public and private money together to increase the amount of investment available in the economy. And there was, in parallel to this trend for more intensive leveraging, is very high stakeholder interest to know whether public-private partnerships were able to provide the expected benefits that were identified in the literature. And I'm going to expand on that in the upcoming slides. Moreover, when looking at the way the public-private partnership market was set as of 2016, we were observing the fact that PPPs were concentrated mostly in few countries when restricting the analysis at the then European member states, with 5 countries, the UK, France, Spain, Portugal, and Germany, which were accounting for roughly 90% of the entire market. So a very concentrated market, which led to a risk that several member states had a very little exposure and experience with such type of projects. Moreover, when we were looking at public-private partnership projects co-funded by the EU, so receiving a part of EU co-funding, we were seeing extremely few supported PPP projects. We were able to identify back then only 84 projects out of the more than 1,700 public-private partnership projects launched in the period 2000 to 2014. Most of these projects were co-funded by the structural and cohesion funds, so via grants, but there were also some few projects that were supported through so-called financial instruments, which very often were implemented by the European Investment Bank under a contract by the European Commission. Having given this overall background of the situation at the time the audit was planned, what did we look at? What was the scope of our audit? Our overall audit question was whether EU-funded PPPs have been effectively managed and provided adequate value for money. And in order, so as you can see, our focus was in public-private partnership projects co-funded, receiving EU co-funding, and we were looking at the outcomes of such projects. And more in detail, our audit strategy was set into 3 main sub-questions. The first one being whether the audited projects were able to exploit the benefits that the public-private partnerships are expected to deliver, so whether reality was matching expectation. The second one, whether audited projects were based on sound analysis and suitable approaches. Therefore, whether the public-private partnership projects were chosen based on sound analysis. And the last one, more broadly, whether the overall institutional and legal framework set up by the member states selected for the audit was adequate for the successful implementation of PPPs in general. In order to reply to this audit question, we selected 12 projects, all of them, of course, public-private partnership receiving EU co-funding, in 2 sectors, road infrastructure and ICT, so information technology. Why so? Because these 2 sectors, from the analysis that we ran before starting the audit, accounted for 93% of all the type of EU-supported PPPs which were launched in the period 2000-2014. We chose those 12 projects in 4 member states, Greece, Spain, France, and Ireland, which as member states were accounting for 71% of all EU money going to PPPs in the reference period. This sample of 12 projects allowed us to audit a total of more than 9.5 billion euro of total cost, which was associated with 2.2 billion euro of EU funding. And it also allowed us to have a good understanding both of projects supported through shared management, so cohesion policy funds where member states are very much involved into the selection and monitoring of the project receiving EU co-funding, and also financial instruments, as I was saying before. So we had a total of 6 projects for road and 6 projects for ICT. What were our main findings as of 2018 when the report was published? Our conclusion was that the EU co-funded PPPs were showing widespread shortcomings and limited benefits. And why it was like that? First of all, because even if the audited projects enabled faster policy implementation and had the potential for good standards of operation and maintenance, the projects we sampled were not always effective in achieving their potential benefits. Secondly, we found delays, cost increases in cases of project underuse, which could be partly attributable to inadequate analysis and unsuitable approaches chosen ex ante. And lastly, the institutional and legal framework was found to be not yet adequate for the EU-supported public-private partnership projects. I'm going now to expand on each of these 3 blocks and giving you some examples of cases that we identified during the audit. Let's start from the first block and talk about faster policy implementation and potential for good operation and maintenance standards. We found that by implementing projects as public-private partnerships, it was possible for the public partner to launch very large infrastructure plans in one go. And these allowed, of course, for a very fast policy implementation. This is the case of Greece, you can see in the map, where with just 3 procedures, the government was able to procure 744 kilometers of motorways. And this is clearly to be compared with the traditional procurement option, where the number of procedures would very easily be larger by a factor of 10. So even some 100 kilometers could be procured, is procured usually with tens of different sections. At the same time, the choice of the PPP option also allowed for a good potential in terms of maintenance and operational standards. This was because in a public-private partnership, the requirement for maintenance and for operating up to standard the infrastructure are very often set up as early as the contract itself. And not only these standards are set up, but in line with the standards, there are penalties and incentives, which very often are automatic. So they are triggered without a specific decision by the part of the public partner. And they impact the amount of the annual payments going to the private sector. So not only maintenance is defined and set up from the start, but the achievement of a certain maintenance level is very often a factor, is very often impacting the bottom line of the private partner. Therefore, there is a very high likelihood that such maintenance is taken into account. And the same goes for operation. However, when we were looking at most of our projects, such projects were not always effective in achieving their expected benefits. And I'm referring here to some of the most, let's say, well-known potential benefits of PPPs in the literature, being them the fact of being able to be delivered on time and on budget, arguably more so than the traditional projects. Why is it that? Because in a public-private partnership, by shifting the risk of implementation to the private sector, the idea is that the private sector will have much more incentive to deliver on time and on budget. Because otherwise, in theory, any delay or any cost overrun incurred will need to be breached and will need to be covered by the private sector itself. Actually, when we looked at our sample of projects, we found, first of all, that the implementation timeline for PPPs was not short, or was not shorter by default, especially because the procurement was taking, in certain cases, much longer than the traditional procurement. And this is quite easily understandable, because in a PPP, you have certain steps in the procurement procedure, such as securing the funding or getting to financial close, which are not there in the traditional procurement. So it depends very much how you measure the overall timeline of procurement when you conclude that PPPs are often have a shorter implementation delay than traditional projects. Then we found delays in the construction phases, even if the project was a PPP, and in certain cases also a cost overrun. And here I think the main case which we highlighted in the report back then was the case of the so-called Greek reset. In Greece, as I was saying in the previous slides, is a very substantial number of kilometers of motorways was launched via a public-private partnership, and this was done under a contract which was transferring the demand risk, so basically was linking the payment going to the private sector to the number of users, to the number of people using the motorway. Of course, when the crisis struck in Greece, and of course it was very deep and affecting very much the number of people using motorways, and therefore, as a result, let's say the amount of the payment going to the private sector, the public sector was basically faced with two options: facing a private partner which was not financially viable anymore, given the fall in the number of drivers and the number of users of the infrastructure. The public partner could either cease the construction of the motorways, but in that case probably expose himself to a series of potential legal procedure against the private partner, which was claiming that such crisis was indeed a kind of force majeure event, or renegotiate the concession agreement to be able to make again the private partner financially viable, but of course requesting higher payment from the public partner. And this is exactly what happened, this second option, where if you see for example, the cost per kilometer for the various motorways before and after the reset, such costs sometimes it's basically doubling. And this due to the reset, due to additional penalties, and due to the fact that the overall scope of the project was also reduced over time. So when we look at the expected benefits, we see that unless the project is very well planned from the beginning, the choice of the PPP itself is not shielding the public partner from such increases in cost and delays. We also saw that the procurement as a PPP project, while allowing for a very fast implementation, as I said in the first slide, increased the risk of insufficient competition. And this is clearly understandable, as the sheer size of the investment requires very specialized and very large companies to take on the implementation of the project, which by definition reduces the number of potential bidders to the procurement option. For example, in one procurement procedure, we saw that the public partner had invited 4 companies to submit bids. In the end, only 2 of them did, and only 1 offer was evaluated at the final stage of procurement. And our conclusion in the report was that having just 1 offer could have limited the the opportunities for having economies, for example, or a better project implementation and better options for the public partner. As a second point, and in talking about the expected benefits and the theoretical benefits of public-private partnership, one which is very often quoted is the fact that by combining the public partner and the private partner and having the private partner share some of the risk of the venture, it would be less likely that the private partner would embark in building a project which is not appropriately sized for the use base. So basically, while sometimes it is called as a risk that the private partner that the public partner is procuring traditional projects which are larger than needed, the academic theoretical findings are that the private partner would curb such over-optimism and such overbuilding, as he will be, the private partner will be the one required to fund the project and make a financially viable project proportionate to the use base. In our audit sample, we found that actually it did not reduce the risk of entering into bigger projects than needed. And you can see some example here, both from the road infrastructure side and from the ICT side, where in the end, the latest data are showing a use base either of road users or of people using the internet connection, which in certain cases was even more than 50% lower than what was the original estimate. And this, of course, can have an impact also of making the project not financially viable at the end, because there is a risk that the revenues generated are not enough to remunerate the private partner and to pay back the lenders that lended money at the moment of the start of the project. So these, in terms of comparing, let's say, the expected benefits of the PPP model with the actual projects that we sampled. I would move now to the second block of the observation, which are focusing on the kind of ex-ante analysis that were run when choosing a project to be performed as a public-private partnership. And here, I'm sure I don't have to remind the audience that there are in the literature certain what they are called good management practices, which are asking public promoters, before embarking in a public-private partnership project, to perform comparative analysis to make sure that the PPP option is offering the best value for money, compared, for example, with the traditional option. And a commonly used tool for such an analysis is the public sector comparator. So we looked in our audit, in the project that we selected for the audit, how much was such public sector comparator or any other comparative analysis used in order for the public sector to be sure that the PPP was the right decision. And out of the 12 projects, we saw that only 3 had comparative analysis run before choosing the PPP option, while for the remaining 9, some of them did not have them because it was a model where it was not the government itself paying for the project, but it was directly final users. So this didn't require any kind of comparative analysis under the national legislation. 5 projects did not carry out a comparative analysis at all, while 1 project we were not given access to the documentation, and therefore we couldn't conclude on whether that was the case or not. The problem is that also in those 3 cases when a public sector comparator was performed, such analysis was still hindered by the lack of reliable data and the over-optimism, for example, in the envisaged revenue levels. As we saw in the previous slide, those kind of ex-ante expectation in certain cases where overshooting the actual results obtained by the project. So this risk of not having a good comparative analysis is relevant, as it might be that in certain cases a traditional project could have delivered better option than the PPP one, or maybe this comparative analysis could have shown that the PPP was indeed the best option, but some tweaks in its design and its contract form could have been brought into and even improved its value added compare and its value for money ultimately. Looking always at the analysis and the ex-ante analysis run by the public partner, we saw that risk allocation was often inappropriate. And here I have several examples. We found, for example, one good practice in France, where the public partner introduced penalties in the contract if the envisaged uptake values provided by the private partner were not met in reality. And this, for us, it's a very good practice because it aligns the incentive of the private partner to make as precise as possible as an estimate. While in other cases, so like in another ICT project, not in France, the procurement, the commercialization model on which the procurement was based were developed by the private partner, for example, while the public partner was the one which was bearing the commercial risk, getting to a point where basically the private partner had no incentive to be factual and realistic in the way he was providing the commercialization models. We saw other cases where allocation of risk was not done, in our view, in a coherent manner. For example, projects where the risk allocated to the private partner were excessive, with a risk of bankruptcy, and so ultimately a risk for the public partner to have to rescue the private partner. Projects where demand and availability risk, so the two main risk categories of risk that we discussed at the beginning, were both shifted to the private partner, but in a way that they could offset each other. So basically leaving the private partner with no financial disadvantages. And also choices where risk were not, in our view, allocated to the party which had the most control on it, for example, in choosing whether to allocate to the private partner the availability or the demand risk. We also found that long duration PPP contracts were poorly suited to the rapid pace of technological change. And this is, of course, especially true as far as the ICT and the information technology projects were concerned. And this was because, in our understanding and in our conclusion, the choice of the public partner to undergo a public-private partnership was not really linked to a strategic reflection on why to use a PPP for such project or for such objective, and I will expand on that more later, but more because of a fear from the public partner of not being able to have the technological skills and technical capability to implement the project as such. So it was not chosen as a PPP because of the potential advantages of the PPP, but more because the public partner feared not being able to implement it under traditional. However, when you couple a contract, which by its nature, by definition, is very long, up to 20, 24 years, with a sector as rapidly evolving as the ICT one, you run the risk of having a considerable technological obsolescence, which means that on one side, users of your project are likely to drop very quickly as they shift to other more modern technologies. And the other side, you as a public partner required to step in yourself and replace the technology much quicker than expected, with potential penalties towards the private partner, because the demand from your citizens, from your users, is to have access to the more modern technology. And this is what we identified in France, for example, where 3 of the 4 projects we had in ICT, a very long contract lifespan, up to 24 years, but included extensive use of wireless technologies, which by definition required very continuously updating in order to keep it as performant as other solutions such as fiber. And those were contracts which were taken on board very often by regional and local authorities, while the national strategy already in 2013 was to achieve 100% coverage with broadband fixed infrastructure. And so this is an example which shows the risk and the concerns to be taken into account when entering into long contracts in fields which are very quickly evolving. So this, as far as the ex-ante analysis part of the observation was concerned, I would now proceed and close with the part on the institutional framework in the member states we visited. And our first conclusion in this regard is that though all 4 of the member states were familiar with public-private partnership, not all of them had a well-developed institutional and legal framework. And here I'm going to give you some differences among the framework we saw. Of course, as I stressed at the beginning, everything is true as at the time of the audit, so it can very well be that in the meantime the situation evolved. In France, for example, we saw that there was a PPP institutional framework, so a set of rules and procedure on how to implement and plan and monitor PPPs, but that was only applying to availability-based PPPs. While other type of PPPs, such as the concession type, the ones where it's the final user that is paying directly the fee to the private partner, were not covered by this framework. Moreover, the framework was only applicable to national public-private partnership, while those that were set up by regional and local authorities were not covered by the scheme. In Ireland, again, the framework was not covering all concession contracts. In Greece, we found a threshold, which was an interesting one, because it was applying on the lower side. So every project run as a PPP with a construction cost below 500 million euro was entering into the so-called standard PPP framework, where projects could have to follow a certain procedure and logic, while very large projects with a construction cost higher than 500 million euro had basically a dedicated ad hoc procedure for each of those projects. And in Spain, at the time of the audit, there was no dedicated department or PPP unit, so automatically there was no institutional and legal framework to support and to harmonize the way such PPPs were implemented at the time. We also saw across the various countries that the visited member states had not developed a clear strategy for the use of PPPs. And here again, why such a strategy would be important? Because those projects, as we had the opportunity to comment before, are very often lasting for several years. And they introduce certain kind of flexibility constraints on future governments. So in our view, it was very important to make sure that the member state had a kind of clear idea on what were the sectors what were the use case for such PPPs to be implemented. And here we found different reasoning behind. In France, for example, at the time of the audit, there was no strategic approach. There was just an indication to use PPPs as much as possible as an anti-cyclical measure to face down the crisis, which at that moment was still triggering its effects. In Ireland and in Greece, PPPs were a source of additional funding. So in one case in Greece to attract private funds, in Ireland for investments to go beyond the national budget. And in Spain, we foresaw, for example, that PPPs were identified more on the basis of their maturity rather than their relevance, impact, or value for money. I make an example. In the case for a motorway in Spain, the section which were chosen to be advanced first were the ones which were more ready from a design perspective, rather than the ones which probably could have attracted more users. And the long-term implication of PPPs, as I said, have also very often an impact in the kind of fiscal flexibility that future governments, both at national and local level, can have in choosing their preferred infrastructure policy. This is very often because such contracts are, as I said, very long and foresee payments that can basically add on top of another up to a moment where basically all the fiscal capacity of a government for infrastructure is already absorbed by previous contracts. So we looked in the member states whether at the time of the audit there were any measure to contain the potential growth of PPPs over time, knowing that, and I'm talking about that in a second, very often PPPs were recorded off balance, and this reduced the kind of normal monitoring of the impact of these contractual flows over the life of the contract. At the time of the audit, for example, France did not, and Spain, they didn't have any ceiling on total annual payment. So in theory, these payments could add up without any limitation. In Ireland, there was a ceiling of 10% of contract payment linked to PPPs, 10% of the overall aggregate capital expenditure, while in Greece, there was a similar threshold of 10% of the annual public investment program, coupled with a second threshold of a maximum of 600 million euro of yearly availability payments. But again, in Greece, these applicable, let's say, to the lower value PPPs, because the other ones, as we said before, were excluded from the scope. And the fiscal flexibility was, the importance of maintaining a certain fiscal flexibility was shown, for example, in the case of Catalonia, Spain, which we report about it in the special report, where the amount of contractual payment were designed in a certain way, which was very much feasible compared to the total investment budget available at the moment of those payments were set. But then, of course, the crisis came and the overall fiscal availability for infrastructure in the roads department shrank considerably, making at the time of the audit, PPPs absorbing a very important share of this fiscal flexibility of the Department for Roads, and therefore potentially jeopardizing other projects or other new projects which were become relevant over time. Before launching into a recommendation, I would like just to focus on the last of the observation included in our report, which concern the possibility of recording public-private partnership projects as off-balance sheet items. And in our view, this possibility was risking to undermine transparency and value for money. As you probably know, indeed, as of the time of the audit, the European system accounting standards, as well as national accounting standards, were allowing to record a PPP project as off-balance sheet items if certain conditions were met, conditions that were primarily linked to the amount of risk and the type of risk that were allocated to the private partner, so out of the public partner towards the private partner. And the logic behind such accounting standard decision was to basically to design the PPPs probably, and I would say desirably, with a kind of ex-ante analysis such as the public sector comparator, in the best possible way from a financially sound financial management perspective, and then to look at how this risk allocation was done and decide the accounting policy for that, whether on balance or off balance. Actually, what we found is that for 5 out of the 12 projects, the possibility to record PPPs off balance was actually a very important consideration in the design of the project. So there was a risk that the process was going the other way around rather than how it was designed. And even for a motorway project, we found that the feasibility study started the risk allocation reasoning with the need of keeping the project off the government balance sheet, as this was one of the fundamental advantages of PPPs. So showing that in certain cases there is a risk that the having the project off balance is driving the choice of risk allocation rather than the other way around, how the process is supposed to run. Having said that, and having brought this kind of observation, I will now go very quickly on the recommendation that we brought. And the first recommendation that the court made to the Commission and to Member States has been not to promote a more intensive and widespread use of PPPs until the issues identified in the report were addressed and the following recommendation given successfully implemented. So here the idea of the court was to ask the Commission and Member States to stop and reflect, to discontinue temporarily the general push towards this leveraging of public and private funds, unless all the weaknesses identified in the report were addressed via the other recommendation. And this is specifically on building an appropriate institutional and a legal framework, increasing assurance that the choice of the PPP is done for value for money reason and not for other reasons, such as accounting purposes, and then to bring tools to be able to manage PPPs in a successful manner. The second type of recommendation we had is to mitigate the financial impact of delays and renegotiation on the cost borne by the public partner. And we saw in the observation part that there have been cases where delays were triggered, where cost overruns were triggered due to renegotiation of the original contract. And therefore, we recommended Member States to identify and propose standard contractual provision to limit the amount of possible extra cost to be paid. So basically to give to the contracting authority a set of standard clauses to avoid potentially dangerous clauses to be included on an ad hoc basis. And then to assess the early contract renegotiation to make sure that having such an early renegotiation is not due to the fact of having contracted a bad contract before, but to make sure that any changes are justified and in line with value for money principle. We had then a third recommendation, which was to base the selection of the PPP option on sound comparative analysis and on the best procurement option. And here we recommended Member States, which were the ones taking finally the decision of whether to go for a PPP or to a traditional procurement, we recommended them to base the selection on sound comparative analysis and appropriate approaches. And here, you remember what we discussed at a certain moment of the presentation, so the fact that the actual uptake, the reality of the project, sometimes and was much lower than the envisaged expectation. We asked member states not only to run a comparative analysis, but also to check how this comparative analysis is stressed under pessimistic scenarios, to avoid to design the project only on a very optimistic scenario, which then doesn't apply in practice. And then, as a corollary, we had a recommendation to the Commission to make sure that we, as Court of Auditor, had access to all the procurement documents, even in cases where the EU support is asked by the private partner and not by the public partner. Recommendation 4 is to establish clear PPP policies and strategies. And here we recommended, on one side, member states to identify the role that PPPs were expected to play within their infrastructure investment policies, to make sure that they are going to sectors in which PPPs on one side are most suitable, and then they are the overall PPP investment is done in a way which potentially could have some limits to make sure that we are not exhausting the entire fiscal capacity. And we recommended the Commission to propose legislative amendments at EU level to concentrate the co-funding support in sector with high strategic relevance. For example, in the case of the road network, for projects belonging to the Trans-European Network for Transport and its core network. So really the section of the network which are the ones with the highest traffic and the most strategic relevance from a EU perspective. And our last recommendation was to improve the EU framework for better PPP projects. So we recommended the Commission, in this case, to link the EU support to the assurance that the choice was justified by value for money consideration. So basically to require an analysis before co-funding is happening, that the PPPs are chosen for the right reasons. We recommended member states to improve transparency by publishing periodic list of PPP projects, so to make sure that the fact that the PPP is off balance is not the reason why there is not enough transparency. Of course, always preserving protection of confidential and commercially sensitive data. And finally, we recommended the Commission to assess the additional complexity of EU blended PPP projects in view of further action aiming at simplifying relevant rules and procedure of EU program. Basically looking forward and trying to make the EU blended PPP projects as easy as possible to be implemented from a procedural view, always keeping in mind that in order for such projects to be effective and to deliver on what they are expected to do and to further both national and European policies, there is a need for a corollary of activities such as the institutional frameworks, the ex-ante analysis, and the choice of the option and the good design of the contract of the PPP contracts. There is a need for all these elements to be together to make sure that EU co-funded projects and EU co-funded public-private partnership projects are delivering on their outcomes. Thank you very much. And I'm happy to take any kind of follow-up question you might be interested in either via email or other exchanges. Thank you very much again for having me to the conference.
Faras kungam, paldies auditoram. Es tomēr gribētu iziet mazliet cauri pa diagonāli, lai ja kāds galīgi varbūt kaut ko palaidis garām, ko teica auditors. PPP projektu skaitam un apjomu kopumā ar tendenci pieaugt. Vislielākais PPP projektu kāpums Eiropas PPP projektu tirgū bija 6. 8. gads. PPP projektu tirgus pārsvarā ir koncentrēts dažās valstīs. Apvienotā Karaliste, Francija, Spānija, Portugāla un Vācija īstenoja projektus 90% apmērā no visa tirgus. Laika posmā no 2000. līdz 2014. gadam Ar Eiropas Savienības fondiem apvienoto PPP projektu bija samērā maz, tikai 84 no, ja pareizi sapratu, 1749. Eiropas Revīzijas palāta ir veikusi auditu, kurā iekļauti 12 Eiropas Savienības līdzfinansēti PPP projektu ceļu un IT jomā, jo šīs nozares veidoja 93% no Eiropas Savienības atbalstītajiem PPP projektiem. Tika auditēti projekti no 4 valstīm – Īrijas, Spānijas, Francijas un Grieķijas. Galvenie trūkumi, kas tika konstatēti, Eiropas fondu un PPP apvienošana veicināja projektu ātrāku īstenošanu, nodrošināja labākus īstenošanas un uzturēšanas standarts, taču nevienmēr projekti bija efektīvi to potenciālo iegūmu sasniegšanā. Kavēšanās un projektu izmaksu pieaugums daļai tika saistīts ar nepietiekamu analīzi un nepiemērotu projektu risinājumu izvēli. Tikai 3 no 12 auditētiem projektiem tika veikta salīdzinoša analīze pirms PPP instrumenta izvēles. Vēl viens apliecinājums tam, ka mums ļoti rūpīgi ir jāplāno savs plāns. Kādi bija secinājumi? Lieli infrastruktūras PPP projekti palielina nepietiekams konkurences risku iepirkumam. Tāpat arī bieži risku sadala projektu ietvaros tika veikta neatbilstoši. Piemēram, bija projekti, kuros privātajam partnerim piešķirtie riski bija pārmērīgi, izraisot pat bankrota riskus un nepieciešami pēc turpmākas valsts sektora iejaukšanās. Ilgtermiņa līgumos netika ņemts vērā straujās izmaiņas tehnoloģijās, kas arī būtu ļoti svarīgi, kas pakļauj projekts ievērojami tehnoloģijas novecojušu riskam un samazināja ieņēmumus, tiklīdz kļūst pieejama jauna tehnoloģija. Mums jābūt vizionāriem, lai saprastu arī tehnoloģijā visu. Eiropas Revīzijas palātas galvenie ieteikumi, plānojot apvienotos projektus, ir izvēloties PPP instrumentu izmantošanu, pamatot to ar saprātīgu salīdzinošo analīzi. Atkal mājas darbs, tā skaitā piemērotāk iepirkuma procedūras analīzi. Lai mazinātu neobjektivitātes risku attiecībā uz PPP, alternatīvās izvēle nodrošināt tālāko pārskatāmību, periodiski publicējot PPP projektu sarakstus, tostarp pieteikumus un jēgpilnus datus par finansētajiem aktīviem, to turpmākajām saistībām un bilances datiem. Vienlaikus saglabājot konfidenciālu un komerciāli sensitīvu datu aizsardzību, tātad salīdzināt. Un visbeidzot, kas mums arī attiecās uz mums, arī jebkurā PPP projektā ir līguma noteikumos ir jāparedz regulējums, kas ierobežo iespējamo papildus izmaksu rašanos, kas jāatcēc publiskajiem partneriem, kā arī līguma agrīnajā stadijā jāpieļauj atkārtotas sarunas, lai nodrošinātu, ka turpmākās publiskā partnera izmaksas ir pamatotas un atbilst izdevīguma principiem. Tā, mājas darbs ir skaidrs.